Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policies webinar today. I'm Sushma Raman, I'm the Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome our distinguished speakers as well as our audience members to today's webinar. But I'd first like to start with a few words about the Carr Center and our work. We serve as the hub for the Harvard Kennedy School's teaching, research, and training in the human rights domain. Our current research priorities include work on technology and human rights, where we examine the ethical and rights implications of technological advancements on society, a project on renewing rights and responsibilities in the United States, which examines the rights and responsibilities that define the relationship of people to each other and to the government. And we plan to issue a policy blueprint around 6 broad themes related to rights and renewal, including democratic process, equal opportunity, privacy, freedom of expression and religion, due process, and sustainability. And finally, a nonviolent action lab that produces and disseminates knowledge on nonviolent action, how it works, and global trends. We're also home to a range of initiatives and programming on a range of human rights concerns, both in the United States and around the world. More recently, the center has created a more explicit focus on the impact of the pandemic on a range of rights, with a focus on those who are most affected by this pandemic, as well as on racial justice and equity in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, as well as numerous other people of African descent. Our webinar series shines a spotlight on a range of scholars, practitioners, policy makers, advocates, and activists. And we launched this series earlier in the month, featuring Megan Francis and Keisha Blaine, focusing on the legacy of racist policing and the role of movements in advocating for change. And in the coming month, we'll be featuring Danielle Allen of the Safra Center and Ruha Benjamin, author of Race After Technology. Today, it's my honor and privilege to welcome 3 distinguished colleagues and friends from Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, a leading human rights organization that I'm proud to be a part of and support and serve on the board of. So I'm going to introduce them briefly in the order of their presentations, and then we'll have a conversation. We'd love to hear from the audience in terms of what's on your mind, and we'll be sure to weave that into our conversation. I'll start with introducing Kerry Kennedy, who I had the honor of meeting about 15 years ago when I was invited to serve on the judging panel for the International Human Rights Award. Kerry is the 7th of Ethel and Robert F. Kennedy's 11 children and is the president of RFK Human Rights. She's a human rights activist, lawyer, and best-selling author, and has devoted more than 4 decades to the pursuit of equal justice, promotion and protection of basic rights, and the rule of law. She works on a range of issues, including child labor, women's rights, indigenous land rights, criminal justice reform, and immigration, just to name a few, and has led hundreds of human rights delegations around the world to support these causes. In a recent op-ed, Kerry wrote, "Cook County Jail is a ticking time bomb for detainees during this pandemic. There's no luxury of time here. People in jail, simply because they do not have the financial resources, should be released." We'll next hear from Wade McMullen, who's a human rights lawyer whose career has been dedicated to supporting grassroots leaders and campaigns for change. He leads RFK's work on working with frontline human rights defenders to topple systemic injustice. And he also works on shrinking the scale, scope, and power of systems of mass criminalization and incarceration in the US. Wade helped secure the release of Pedro Hernandez, a Bronx teenager caged on Rikers Island for over a year on false charges, and helped coordinate efforts to free over 100 people unjustly incarcerated on unaffordable money bail across New York City over the course of a month. He's represented high-profile prisoners of conscience and argued high-impact cases before the African Court on Human and People's Rights, the Inter-American Commission, and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. And finally, we'll hear from Sancia Dalley, who's a seasoned leader in economic access and equity. She leads the Compass Investor Program, where she informs investors and asset managers of the human rights issues to consider during their investment process of seeking superior risk-adjusted returns. She provides appropriate connections and tools to support their work on the S in ESG, in order to catalyze action that will yield both profits and positive impact for people and the planet. A small example of their work. Compass and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers pushed for legislation in the state of New York to provide better working conditions for farm workers and better pay. Compass has engaged investors to pressure companies to pledge to pay more for the tomatoes they buy so that the increases can be passed on to the farm workers in the fields, ensuring they can earn a living wage. Sancia comes to this work with a long career in working with the private sector, including brokering multi-million-dollar partnerships to advance global health and advising Fortune 500 companies. So we have a very rich and diverse array of expertise on this panel today. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Kerry to get us started. And I look forward to engaging with you. You can post your questions in the chat function on YouTube, and we look forward to continuing the conversation once we hear from our speakers. Kerry?
Thanks, Sushma. So I think I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about the work of RFK Human Rights, and then introduce, and hand it over to Wade. So RFK Human Rights was started in 1968 by my father's family and friends to carry forward his unfinished work on social justice. And today we're engaged in 4 areas. We hold governments responsible for human rights abuses, primarily through advocacy and litigation. So when Uganda passed a law that made homosexuality punishable by life in prison without parole, we sued the government and we overturned the law. We have about 35 cases at any given time, primarily in Latin America and Africa. And I'm so proud to say that under Wade's leadership and Angelita Bayan's leadership, we've never lost a case. The second program is that today, of the 100 largest economic entities worldwide, 75 of them are multinational corporations. They used to all be governments, but today they're multinationals. 5 years ago, there were only 50, but today it's 75. So as the influence of corporations grows financially, their influence on our lives grows exponentially. And so we want to hold those corporations accountable for human rights abuses as well. And we do that through the investors in those corporations, the entities that own the biggest stakes in those corporations. And that's the program that Sancia runs, and she'll be speaking a little bit about that. Robert F. Kennedy Compass. We bring together about 150 people twice a year who control about $7 trillion in investments managed, which is roughly 10% of the world's economy. And we talk to them about the impact of human rights violations on investment outcomes. Sancia will be speaking about that in a moment. Then the third program we have is we believe if we hold the governments responsible and the corporations responsible, it's for naught unless we train the next generation of human rights defenders. So we have a human rights education program that, through the teachers we work with, reaches thousands and thousands of students across the United States and around the world, and then about 35 million students through our online educational offering. It's available to about 35 million. The fourth area is honoring the defenders. So journalists, frontline human rights defenders, and others who are changing our world. Those are the people who we honor with our awards. Everything we do begins with the values and visions of Bobby Kennedy. And I just want to tell you this short story. When on April 4th, 1968, my dad was campaigning for president in Indianapolis. And he was scheduled to speak that night to a crowd in the largest African-American neighborhood of that city. And John Lewis had organized that rally. My father then found out that Martin Luther King had been killed, and he went and spoke to that rally and had the terrible burden to inform people that their leader had been murdered. That night, 125 cities across our country broke out in riots and looting and protests, a lot of them peaceful protests. The next day, the white sort of city fathers across the country said, now we don't owe anything to the Black community because they've used violence. And so my father wanted to counter that narrative. And he went to the Cleveland City Club, which is a bastion of white power, white male power. And he spoke about the institutions of violence that happen, that are the source of those people's power, and that must be broken down if we want to stop riots from happening again. So we made a little clip of his speech there. It's 2.5 minutes long. We want to show that to you, but I have to say, just a warning beforehand, a lot of these images are very, very tough about police violence, anti-Black violence over the last several weeks. So if you've had too much of that, you might want to miss the video, but otherwise, please watch. And we need volume. There's no volume on the video.
There's no volume.
Whenever any American's life is taken unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings. Some accuse others of rioting and inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger in schools without books. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. We learn at the last to look at our brothers as alien. For when you teach a man to hate and to fear his brother, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of his color, then you also learn to confront others, not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. To be met not with cooperation, but with conquest, to be subjugated and to be mastered. We learn to share only a common fear, only a common impulse, to meet disagreement with force. But this much is clear: violence breeds violence, repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. We must admit the vanity of our false distinctions and learn to find our own advancement in search for the advancement of all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now let's turn this over to Wade McMullen, who has really led our efforts on immigration reform, on farm workers domestically, and of course, decarceration, bail reform, and stopping anti-Black violence. Wade?
Hi, Kerry, and thank you, Sushma, and to the Carr Center and Harvard Kennedy School and all those joining us this afternoon here on the East Coast or whatever time it may be where you're tuning in. I'm just a little bit of context about where I'll be speaking from. So I'll be speaking today from my experience as a human rights lawyer and a civil rights lawyer and a researcher, particularly around the international human rights framework of policing in the United States. As well as an advocate who has spent a good part of the last 5 years working directly with frontline advocates in cities around the United States who are on the front lines of attempting to reduce the scale, scope, and power of systems of mass criminalization and incarceration in the country. So wanted to start there and just to recognize that it's important to name that nearly all of my work and knowledge either comes directly from or at least builds upon the really important theoretical work done by so many outstanding academics and practitioners, particularly Black feminists like coming from the traditions of Angela Davis, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Mariame Kaba, as well as the predominantly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx organizers I get to work with day in and day out, who are on the front lines doing this work to make communities safe, safe from policing, safe from incarceration, despite the enormous odds and personal costs to them in doing this. So wanted to name that. And it gets really to the crux of our approach as a national organization founded in the memory and to carry on the legacy of Bobby Kennedy, because during his lifetime, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, as a senator, and as a presidential candidate and a public figure, thought that it was really important to leverage his spotlight, his access, his privilege to stand in solidarity, to work with as an ally, as an accomplice, and to lift up the platforms by which other leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, Marion Wright Edelman in the Mississippi Delta, and so many others could have their voice be heard by the mainstream that was, historically ignoring them. So at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, we believe that those closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, but are often farthest from access to power and resources. And so that's the bridge we seek to divide in our human rights work abroad and at home. So my role here is to communicate three things about the current moment we find ourselves in from a human rights perspective. And I wanted to break it down first into what's going on right now in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's and Tony McDade's and Rayshard Brooks and so many other murders that has caused the righteous anger and outrage and fueled rebellions and protests across the country. What's going on right now? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Two, what are people demanding in response? In particular, what are those who are most directly impacted by the problems and the human rights violations demanding, and who those people are? That's the third part, is who is demanding these things. So first, starting with what's going on right now. First, it's important to recognize that this is nothing new. This has been happening in one shape or form since before this country was even founded as a nation. And the catalytic moment that we are in there, where the consciousness of our entire country and society is shifting and changing and becoming more open to the realities of what's going on, is due to the long, hard work of organizers who've been doing this and who've been saying this for a very long time, only now, being listened to, being published in the op-ed pages of the New York Times even. And so it is nothing new. And we do have a once in a generation opportunity to shift this culture, to build and to continue to push for the demands and the analysis that has been occurring time immemorial from these folks, more into the mainstream, and to accelerate the rate of change of what's really needed to root out the sources of systemic violence and systemic racism. Starting with police violence. So right now, so much of the conversation is around violence by police. And yes, rightfully so, the killings by police. We've had the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings talking very strongly about the systemic problem of the killings of Black and African Americans by police, and the lack of accountability, the lack of legal standards that even regulate the use of force by policing in the United States. But when we talk about the violence in policing, we also need to recognize that it goes beyond just murders and killings and impunity to the everyday violence of policing that is part and parcel, that is rooted, endemic into the very nature of what policing even is and how it has existed in this country. So from the violence of traffic or street stops and stop and frisks, proactive patrolling and surveillance of predominantly Black and brown and low-income neighborhoods, to the policing systems, in addition to the police individually, being the tip of the spear in the disproportionate criminalization of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So when we talk about violence, we need to recognize that violence exists at multiple levels. And I'm going to get to the economic violence in a second. And second, I think that one thing to recognize too, when we're talking about the discrimination element of the violence, is that it's systemic. It's a systemic racism in the systems of policing. It's not racism as manifests in the individual decisions of a white cop against a young Black man or woman of color, but it is systemic. And then that notion of systemic racism, most recently articulated extremely well by the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, gives us a framework to really analyze, and a lens of analyze, and a helpful vehicle to see what is going on here beyond the surface level manifestations of harm and violence and killings. And we have good reason to be concerned, right? US policing is out of control. Killings themselves have gone unabated and continued at the same rates since we even just started tracking them in the wake of the murder of Michael Brown in 2014. Even during COVID, when crime rates were falling, people were quarantining and not coming out in the streets, the rates of police killings did not change at all. We incarcerate as a country a higher percentage of our Black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid, 4 times the rate. So in historical and comparative analysis, we have good reason to be concerned, not just about individual actions of police, but our systems of policing and our systems of mass incarceration. One thing to note before I move on to what people are demanding here is just the history, right? Police systems arose, particularly in the US South, out of slave patrols. Police were then charged with enforcing Black codes that criminalized quality of life crimes that essentially ensured that free Blacks in the South would then be labeled as criminals and funneled into a system of convict leasing, arguably even more cruel than the system of slavery that preceded it. And their labor was extracted to continue to build the economy of the South. And this is where we start to get into that inextricable link with class, inequality, and socioeconomic rights that are embedded into our systems of policing that have taken on a racialized dynamic from the very inception. So the racism is inextricably linked in the discriminatory practices and systemic practices with suppression of socioeconomic rights, particularly of Blacks, dating back to the time of the abolition of slavery in this country. And here at Harvard, you have a wonderful colleague and historian in Elizabeth Hinton that has actually detailed a lot of this. That if you look at particularly the programs that were instituted by the namesakes of our respective institutions, President Kennedy and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, to address violence in poor and Black communities during the 1960s, those programs were initially initiated to get at the root causes of violence, which were poverty, lack of opportunity, and were designed to provide support to attack the root causes of violence in our society, instead of to police and further criminalize and surveil these communities on the back end. Unfortunately, those very institutions and programs and economic programs that were continued a little bit into the Johnson administration were soon hijacked and soon led to more surveillance and policing and criminalization, co-opted by Richard Nixon intentionally in his intentional racist strategy to cultivate a, quote, war on crime and war on drugs, and then supercharged by the Reagan administration that led to the ballooning of our systems of mass incarceration, the ballooning of policing budgets across the country, and then doubled down upon by the Democratic Party and during the Clinton years and the crime bill, and gutting things like welfare and other programs that actually provide the support and stability for communities to prevent violence in the first place. And that leads us to where we are today, where it is really hard to imagine an alternative to a way of protecting our communities and ensuring public safety apart from police, because it's been 65 years, 70 years of our society reinforcing it at the highest levels that police make us safe. And policing, the systems of policing and incarceration, is the thing that we need for public safety. And that brings me to, what are people demanding right now? So one of the primary demands that you've undoubtedly heard come out of this moment of rebellion and uprising and protest is the demand to defund the police. And immediately that can conjure, without, if you stay on the superficial level, thoughts of impracticability, or what does that mean for violence and how do we protect ourselves? But I want to offer just a little bit of a deeper dive to really unpack what that demand means. So first, as you move beyond the slogan, you realize that it is actually a demand, a positive demand, rooted in a positive intentional call to reimagine what public safety, what the right to life, what the right to well-being and personal integrity, and the rights to actually accomplish the socioeconomic rights protections that are enshrined in international instruments, to reimagine what that looks like in our society. And it's a demand coming from people who want public safety, who have been harmed by violence, by the systems, and by violence in their communities. And what they're calling for is to divest from these systems that do not work effectively to protect people from harm. So to divest from harmful policing because of its roots and how it was established and what it accomplishes today, not making communities safe. And to reinvest that cost savings in municipal budgets, to reallocate that into the services that actually promote community well-being and help attack violence at the very root cause by helping people have access to education, housing, healthcare, and opportunity. And these are the things that actually protect communities and help them remain safe. So at its core, when people are saying defund the police, they're saying divest from harmful policing that actually makes people less safe, and invest that money instead into these things that promote community well-being and stability. And if you do that, over time, you will see reductions in violence by attacking it at its roots causes. Some just quick facts here is that, since those anti-poverty programs I referenced of the 60s were co-opted by policing and surveillance, local police budgets have ballooned, and in some cities represent close to 40% of city budgets today. And at the same time, we've seen reductions in those types of services and rights to well-being that actually promote the community stability and safety. Right now, millions of school children attend a school in this country where multiple police officers are employed, but not a single nurse or counselor is. So it gives you a little bit of a window into how much we can start to reallocate those funds. The New York Times just did an analysis of police budgets where only 1 to 5% of police time is spent responding to violence. If only 5% of their time is responding to rapes or murders, what are they doing with 95% of the rest of their time in their budget? It begs a question. And then finally, who is demanding this? I started this by talking about RFK's methodology and way of working and supporting those who are on the front lines in solidarity. And it's really important to center them, because these are local Black-led organizations and organizers, Indigenous and Latinx people who are situated in the communities most directly impacted by systemic violence. And not only do human rights, the International Human Rights Project call us to engage in advocacy and defense of those human rights, to realize them, but human rights principles also call us to engage that work in a participatory manner, to give voice to those who are most directly harmed, survivors and victims, and to follow their lead. And so while you're going to hear lots of things and conflicting opinions, I really just want to call us back to that human rights principle of participation and ensuring that the voices that are most harmed by our systems of criminalization and incarceration continue to be centered as we work our way towards those solutions to not only stopping human rights abuses from occurring in the future, but repairing the harm that these systems have caused in the past. And I think that's it's my turn to turn it over to our colleague Sancia right now to dive a little bit more into the economic parts of this issue, particularly what people who hold so much power, economic power in our society, can be doing.
Sure, thanks, Wade, and that was a nice overview. I think it segs nicely into the work that I lead at the organization at RFK Human Rights, where we spend most of our energies focused on the investment sector, the sector that is largely not seen by the public, but who, as Kerry mentioned at the top of her introduction, are the ones controlling the wealth and the decisions around where these investments are made, how they're made, and how it impacts society. I think one thing to keep in mind here is that it can feel quite overwhelming when we think about sort of the breadth of investments that exist in our society. But one of the things that we champion within the work that we do with this investment sector is the notion that the decisions that you make, and if you think about these investments in the form of lives, every dollar that is invested has the potential to change an individual, a community, a family. And the ripple effect of that across our society is enormous. And so with that in mind, I think it's important to offer a bit of historical context, and I recognize we're getting close to time and really would love to dig into a Q&A, but let me just set the context here. When we talk about the struggle for Black lives, we need to understand that the economic disparities we see today for Black people like me, is that we were brought to this country for economic reasons, as a means to grow the wealth of the white ruling class. That's the reality that we live in. And for over the course of the last 400 years, though freedom came in some respects physically, structurally, those restrictions were built and maintained even more forcefully. So these economic systems that were put in place were set up to prohibit Black Americans from building wealth here. And I think also a point I want to reinforce here is that all of us know that wealth is the means to security, and that you can't build wealth on income only, and that it is a series of acquisition of assets, making those investments and minimizing debt that is then passed down through generations that enables us to actually build wealth in America. And unfortunately, the reality that we live in today is that our economic structures were designed and work rather impressively to exclude Black Americans and other minorities from doing just that. If you take a look at the redlining issue that we see here that make it difficult for Black families to seek loans, get access to capital, that was enacted in the Housing Act of 1934, that effectively cordoned off and segregated Black communities from banking institutions, prevented them from building relationships with banking institutions, prevented them from developing their communities, which, as we all know, lead to higher taxes, which are then invested in local schools and other social services. So to say that the system is working is an understatement, because it is, and it's worked the way in which it was designed. And so where are we today in terms of this economic context? And I think it's important to map this out, because then we'll have a good sense as I share with you sort of how we are working with the investment sector. So just a couple of stats I think it's important to reinforce. White families have substantially more wealth than Black families. The median net worth of white families is 10 times more than that of a Black family. You know, roughly this works out to be $17,000 for Black families versus $171,000. And that's data from the US Census back in 2018. So I'm not talking about 10, 20 years ago. I'm talking about 2 years ago. And the same goes for Black household income. The median income is $41,000. It's 60% less than that of white households. If we take a look at who is controlling some of these assets, less than 2% of the $75 trillion of global assets under management is managed by Black-owned or other minority funds. So even within the investment sector, we're seeing this systemic challenge for Black business leaders, Black entrepreneurs, and by extension, Black families, Black individuals, Black communities, from truly building wealth and passing this wealth down. I came across a stat recently, and I'll share more about this initiative, but there are 4,700 banks in America, and they control $20.3 trillion of assets. And only 21 of these banks are Black owned or led, and they only have $5 billion in assets. Black people make up 13% of the population in this country. That is less than 1% of the country's commercial Black banking assets that is controlled by Black Americans. That is a problem. And those are some of the areas that we, within the context of our RFK Compass work, is really championing investors like public pension funds who control the retirement plans and monies of teachers, police officers, educators and public health workers around our country, university endowments. We're looking at private equity firms. This is the community that we spend the bulk of our time trying to inform them of the issue first and foremost, so that they understand what the landscape is. And secondly, trying to identify where are the highest wins that if they were to make and take several, few steps, these could materialize in systems change as opposed to what I call surface level change that Kerry likes to say they wiggle out of. So that's what we focus on within the context of our Compass work. And more recently, in the midst of this COVID crisis, we have been partnering with a group of socially responsible investors who have issued call to actions around areas that investors can focus on at the board level in terms of making decisions that provide provisions for better working conditions for essential workers in our country, providing protective equipment and gear for workers on the front line, and more importantly, as the issue of racial injustices become more visible for America, because to Wade's point, it was always there. We are now working and will be releasing in a day very shortly a 4-point action plan around how investors can adjust and take action to enhance economic equity and, by extension, racial equity in our country. I'm happy to go into what some of those actions look like, but Sushma, I'm cognizant of time, and I just want to stop there and certainly can provide more examples of what we're calling for.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for sharing your very diverse, but also very aligned perspectives on the current moment. So we had a speaker recently, Alan Jenkins, who is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School and formerly ran a group called Opportunity Agenda and has worked in civil rights and human rights. And he talked about the current moment, drawing on the work of Reverend Barber and others, being one around a third Reconstruction. And, we need a fundamental reconsideration of our constitution, systems, institutions, and practices to uphold human rights and ensure equal opportunity for all. And, just drawing on Sancia's comments, and maybe I'll start with you, Sancia, but if we were to reimagine any one institution or set of institutions or sector at this moment, what are sort of 1 to 3, maybe it's your 4-point plan, but what are 1 to 3 recommendations that you would have for that sector or institution? And I'll start with you since you just ended on that note, and then I'll maybe turn to Wade and then to Kerry.
Sure, Sushma, happy to respond to that. I think the first piece that we are calling for is that investors really look critically at your portfolios and, excuse me, eliminate any companies in your portfolio that their business models, their products, their practices support a racist economic and legal system, such as divesting from private prisons. Let's just start right there. That is it's a challenge. It's difficult to manage. It's difficult to report on in those contexts. We support companies who are finding ways to remove predatory lending practices by financial institutions. We're calling for investors to focus on that, in particular, cash lending, payday lending schemes. These are some of the businesses that have been built in direct response to the economic exclusion and challenge obstacles that Black people face in local communities. And it's a very predatory system in these local communities. So that's one concrete action. We're also calling for companies to build racially inclusive workplaces. For all the work we've done and the talk we've had on diversity and inclusion over the last 10 years, we are far from it. I believe the latest stat is there's one Black CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I mean, in 2020, that's just unacceptable. And so we are calling for investors to push with their companies to put more Black board members on the boards of the companies. We say 5 within the next 12 months. One of the actions we're calling for, we're saying, don't say to us that the talent pipeline is there. If I hear that statement one more time, I feel like I'd scream. The talent is there. Black colleges and universities have stellar students graduating every single year. Go out and seek and recruit and hire from these institutions. It takes effort, and by putting in that effort, we can start building a pipeline of business leaders who understand our communities and who can make decisions not only to seek profit, but who can make decisions that have long-term impact on the communities from which they come and the communities that they want to envision for their families. So those are just a couple of actions. There are several others that we champion. I'm sure Kerry would mention a few, but you know, those are just a couple of examples, Sushma, that we're calling for.
Thank you. Wade?
Sure. So far be it for me to have an original thought, but I wanted to start by saying, you know, the great prison abolitionist thinker Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, you know, prison abolition only requires one thing, to change one thing, and that is everything. And when you talk about prison abolition, people talk about the prison industrial complex, a direct through line from the military industrial complex that illustrates the complexity about how incarceration, punishment, policing, and surveillance is ingrained into the economic systems and cultural systems that have our society is rooted in. And I love the framework of a new era or a third era of Reconstruction, you know, thinking about the civil rights movement as that continuing, that second era of Reconstruction, and then today in this third movement. And I think it's a really helpful thing to think about. And so, you know, there's so many things that, you know, individual systems and everybody, wherever they have influence or power, or, you know, even in their own relationships and communities, to start there. So start there, reimagining things. And so I would kind of just do a little bit of a twist on your question. Instead of institutions or spaces, I would just say of concepts. One, the concept of public safety. To really reimagine what we mean by public safety, who we're saying should be safe, and how that happens. Our society has been just so beaten over the head through tough on crime, racialized narratives that we believe police make us safe, when all of the evidence show that that's actually not true, and that policing isn't necessary for public safety. Yet we invest so much in the violence of the military and the violence of policing. And so to start rethinking what we mean by public safety, what keeps communities safe? And I think starting there is going to have threads into so many different institutions that need to be rethought, and provides us an opportunity to actually start to put resources behind that thinking. And then the second thing is, you know, exactly to the economic underpinnings of what is going on right now is, you know, how do we share wealth, you know? And what does that look like? And, you know, instead of an extractive model, what about worker-owned co-ops, or where workers have, you know, an invested stake into the wealth that's created by companies and corporations under our current system? So I'd say those two things are good places to start.
Thanks, Wade, and thanks, Sancia. And I want to again say thank you, Sushma, for this opportunity. You know, Wade and Sancia and I trade emails and phone calls, getting stuff done every single day. And for me, it's really, this is a treat to hear them speak each and sort of put it all together instead of being focused on the minutia of actually getting the job done. So this has been great. So you ask what are a few things we can do? Number one, defund the police. That would be dramatic, as Wade has pointed out. And I think we actually have a really great model in the United States about how to make communities healthy and safe. And that is, all we have to do is look at wealthy white communities, you know, where there's access to healthcare, there's full access to healthcare, there's full access to mental health care, there's great education, there's incredible job training and job preparation. There's mentorships and internships. And if you make a mistake, you definitely don't go to jail. You get reprimanded, you get warned, your parents get called, you get taken from school. They never put you in jail. That's what we need. Treat people with love and kindness and this essential belief that each of us are a child of God, that we each have great capacity and great value, and we're looking for that value in each one of us. That's the way it works in the wealthy white world. Let's just make it work in the rest of the world as well. That's number one. Number two, the chair of our board, as you know, Sushma, is Robert Smith. And he says the biggest, quickest, longest lasting way to advance economic justice and make a positive impact in minority communities is to invest directly in their financial architecture, which has been abandoned by large banks and is now comprised largely of MDIs and CDFIs. So generational change can be achieved within 10 years through injections of tier one capital into approximately 20 Black banks via investments. 20 Black banks across our country, $2 billion a year. Where are you going to get that money? The net income of the 10 largest US banks, which are all controlled by white people, over the last 10 years was $968 billion. Investing just 2% of that would mobilize $19 billion. So we just take $2 billion of that per year and put it into those 20 biggest Black banks, and we will create $1.5 trillion in additional economic outcome from the United States, which is great, and we will transform the Black community. So I think that's a second thing to do. Third, as Wade said, we always, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers based in Florida has pioneered this work, which has been now spreading across the world, but on worker-led social responsibility. And that means talking to the workers about what they need to feel safe in the workplace, to work with dignity, and have a living wage and having the working conditions that they need. That should be standard practice across all places of work in the United States. And then the fourth thing I would say is, if you say one thing that you can do to transform the next generation, truly transform the next generation, I think the answer is to dramatically increase the emotional intelligence of the next generation. Dramatically increase that. And we know how to do it. It's through social emotional learning. And we're doing that right now with the Speak Truth to Power Human Rights Education program that's taught across the globe at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. We need to put that into every school in this country. And there's my four solutions, four-step solution.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for your remarks, and I'm still digesting it. And I think a couple of the points that I'm struck by, and again, like each of you, I'm involved in your work but in a more tangential way. And I'm struck by the sort of the very clear connection between the civil and political rights and the economic, social, cultural rights. We don't often see that in the US context. We often see groups that are focused on one or the other. And I do think we often look to the rest of the world for leadership on economic rights. And I think it's heartening to see that interconnectedness in the way you frame your work and approach it. The second thing I'm struck by is both sort of the focus on the individual, the leader, and the focus on systems change and institutional reform. And then the third thing I'm struck by, we didn't really talk about your global work, but I know you have a body of work around the world. And I imagine that some of the strategies you've worked on internationally inform your work domestically and vice versa. So it's a very rich conversation, and I think a lot of scope for us to think about further. So I'm curious at this point, if you can talk a bit about this arc that has occurred in the last few months. When COVID-19 hit, people that I know who are activists both in the immigration space as well as in the space of sort of mass incarceration, we're talking about issues of bail and issues of people who are being detained, whether in immigrant detention or people who are being detained because they couldn't afford bail, and they were being held in conditions that could exacerbate their exposure to COVID-19. And so there was like a large amount of outrage and activism around that. And then we very, very quickly shifted, in late May to a larger conversation, which has now been framed as defund the police, but it's really talking about reimagining public safety and reimagining, how we approach problem solving, right? Like we've delegated problem solving on a range of issues, from your traffic light went out on your car, or you ran through a stop sign, or even like the policing of Black bodies in what are predominantly white spaces. And so there's been this very rapid shift. And on the economic front, as I'm hearing you talk, Sancia, I also see a shift where I think in the past there's been a lot of sort of very, ill-defined calls for greater diversity. And we see a lot of companies that have been putting out like diversity and inclusion statements. I mean, please, Harvard is replete with these statements, which have no teeth to them and no money. And so now what I'm hearing is really a shift to talk about power and resources and shifting those to individuals and families and communities and Black-led institutions. And so this is a very dramatic shift in conversations and framing in a matter of months. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on how to best leverage these moments and turn them into movements and kind of keep the pressure on and to make things actionable. So, I'm happy to start with any of you on, 1 to 3 things that we can do, whether as individuals or, people in our audience are in academia or they're heading companies, they're donors. What are 1 to 3 things we can do to keep that pressure on to actualize this shift that is happening over the last few months?
Sure. I'm happy to take a crack at that first, Sushma. I think first and foremost, there's a lot of education that needs to happen and a lot of learning and unlearning. We've been hearing that. I think at an individual level, it's up to each of us to spend the time to identify one issue. It feels overwhelming. I can tell you, as a woman of color, as a Black woman, I immigrated to the US 21 years ago. There are things I did not understand and learn about the African American experience in America that I am learning even as I'm doing this work. So I think it's time to just, for each of us to just identify the issue that is closest to you, dig into that, learn about it, and identify and figure out what you can do to take some action. So education, I think, is one. Secondly, your dollar counts. We often, the fashion industry is a good example of this movement around sustainability, where the more you educate consumers around the wastage that occurs within the industry, you see this shift of new businesses being created that are eco-friendly, etc. We need that same energy and shift to build up and help grow wealth within Black-owned companies, Black entrepreneurs, Black startups. And so at an individual consumer level, we as consumers can direct where our dollar goes. Find a company, you might be into beauty products. I love lipsticks. So let's find a Black-owned beauty company and purchase from there, as an example. You can use your voice to take action. There is an initiative that's been born out of all of this racial injustice, injustices these past few weeks, called the 15% Pledge. It's being led by a Black-owned designer, and they are calling for the major retailers in America, so your Targets, your Whole Foods, Sephora, your Amazon, to allocate 15% of your shelf space to Black products and Black entrepreneurs. And we need consumers to be putting pressure on these entities to sign that pledge, because they can then work with this coalition to think about the supply chain to ensure that those products make it on the shelves of these retailers. So that's another piece. For us at RFK, one of the other area is through shareholder activism. We have to continue to inform and educate shareholders, but we have to hold feet to fire. It's all well and good that you can say that you're trying to get 22% returns on your portfolio, but a 15% return in profits with a 4 or 5% allocation into a Black-owned investment fund is another is also an appropriate approach to take. And the data shows us that investing with a socially responsible lens does not mean fewer returns. In fact, that's on par in today's society. And even now, over the last 4 months, there is a growing interest in socially responsible investment products. So across the individual, you can learn. As a group of consumers, you can take action through your dollars and through signing petitions that enforce some of these approaches. And as an investor, investors can reallocate portions of their assets under management into Black-owned funds. So those are just a couple of examples from my perspective.
So if I can ask you a quick question from the audience before we move on, which is that how can people or individuals figure out which companies invest in private prisons or other kinds of, systems that are, violating human rights?
Sure. One really helpful resource is Yahoo Finance. If you go onto Yahoo Finance, you can search by a company name and you can see the list of investors and where those investments occur. There's lots of resources on Yahoo Finance that you can find where that's concerned. But here are a couple of examples. 3M, they make stationery, but they also are a huge supplier of medical equipment and other products to the prison industrial complex. Food service, to Wade's point, when you think about the prison industrial complex, it's not just the security features that are there, it's the food, it's the healthcare that's delivered. So, Aramark, I hate to call them out, but that's the reality. They are one of the top suppliers of food services to the prison industrial complex. Is your retirement dollars invested in these companies? Part of the challenge is that some of the way in which assets are structured in the investment sector is that it becomes harder, depending on how that structure is established, to see which companies you're in. But at a surface level, you can go on Yahoo Finance, think about the food, the healthcare that's delivered, the labor that's extracted, and identify the companies that are associated with that. There's a helpful resource, Shushma, that I'm happy to share with you that lists a number of companies by sector. Surveillance and technology, that's a big one. Monitoring devices, for example, lots of startups in that area, but whose product exclusively is purchased by this criminalized surveillance system. So happy to share that list. Look at Yahoo Finance and dig into these issues some more, and we're happy to provide some more resources.
Thank you. I'll turn to you, Wade, next, and then to Kip.
Sure. Sorry about talking over you. So I was just going to say that the organization Worth Rises, .org, they produce a report every year. I think their latest one details lists over almost 4,000 private corporations that profit from our prison industrial complex. So that's a very tangible place that you can go look. And in terms of what we can be doing right now, I echo what Sancia was saying and what Kerry was saying about getting educated. Getting educated about how, when people say defund the police, what they're actually talking about is the reallocation of where your tax dollars are being spent, that actually away from things that cause more harm to things that actually root out violence and poverty and systemic inequality at the very root causes. And we're talking about policing, surveillance, and incarceration. They're all intertwined and inseparable here. And so get educated, and then also get proximate. Is particularly, non-Black people, particularly white people, particularly people of higher economic status, are far removed from these systems that are harming people, the systems of policing, surveillance, and incarceration. And every once in a while, we are impacted and infected by our loved ones, or ourselves getting looped into them as well, but our experiences are very different. So get proximate, not only to get educated in the theory and the studies and the statistics and the policy, but to the people who are being directly impacted. Visit a prison, go to a city council meeting and identify the people who are speaking up about these harmful practices, and then go support that organization locally. And so when you get yourself educated and when you get proximate to the people and to the communities and the systems that are harming people, your perspective just becomes wide open. And then, wherever you are, you can start to take action. Just this last week, the nurses union in New York City announced that they are calling for a $2 billion divestment from policing and incarceration in New York City, and in a reinvestment of those funds into health services. These are, workers who, haven't had access to protective equipment during COVID, or sufficient resources to, provide services during COVID. And they're also calling for, a $30 billion revenue raise through taxing people who are billionaires in the state in order to fund these services that make communities safe from a public health model. And so when you start to get educated, when you start to get proximate, you realize that whatever sphere of life that you are in, there is a way to intersect with these harmful things that are going on in our society, and to leverage your voice, whether it's a nurse or whether it's a teacher or an educator, to get policing systems and the school to prison pipeline out of schools. There's so many ways that we can be taking action to do that. And then also just in your personal relationships, what does it look like to seek reconciliation and transformative justice instead of to call the cops on your family members? And to what does that look like for your relationships and how you interact with your own communities?
I just echo a lot of what Sancia and Wade have said. I think, a lot of people have said to me, defund the police, but it's not really good. It's not a good bumper sticker because it gets people all upset, and you should just say, make our communities safer. And my reaction is, when I say we're going to make our communities safer, the reaction of so many of my white empowered friends is, oh, okay, that's great. What did you see on Netflix last night? Whereas if you say, no, we're going to defund the police, they say, wait a second, what are you talking about here? And they want to get engaged. So part of this is start the conversation, get educated. What does this mean? Ask the questions, try and figure it out. How is that going to impact you and your family and your community? What does that mean for our whole country? I think that's so important. Get into the depth of this. There's so much information out there today. There's so many articles people can get to. There's so many excellent podcasts. There are fantastic books. So we have more availability than ever. And then second thing I'd say is internships are not enough. You know, I've been on 2 conference calls in the last week with major investors who have said that they're going to start an internship program in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's just not going to make it. So I think we have to hold these corporations and these investment vehicles really accountable and reach high. The last time we had this type of movement in our country was 50 years ago. We need to take all this energy and make our demands and make them big and make them long lasting. So, and then diversity and inclusion, also not enough. You have to do workplace dignity within the workplace, and that is a much deeper, richer, more important program. And then the last thing I would say is go reread the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is a beautiful document. That's a beautiful document, and it calls on the greatest traditions in Islam and Christianity, in the Jewish religion, in Confucian, everything. It's all in there. And it's really an expression of what humanity is if we are at our very best. And it's a great document. It's the roadway forward. Just use that and we can create change.
Thank you so much, Kerry, Wade, and Sancia, and thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the coming weeks and months. And good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us, Sushma.